In today's video, we are going to find out whether the RTX 5070 Ti is good enough for path tracing in the big four games. Hello and welcome to my new gaming channel. I'm Ben London and I'm a Germany-based AAA PC gamer and hardware enthusiast. I'm going to do things a little bit differently. First off, as you can see, all my content is in ultra-wide format. Secondly, I'm shifting the focus away from traditional data-heavy benchmarking. Instead, I'll be sharing real-world hands-on impressions that reflect how games actually play and feel. Now, when I say real-world experience, there are a few elephants in the room when it comes to the current state of PC gaming.
4 elephants, 1 GPU.
Next to me, you can see this bad boy, which I built back in December 2020 for the release of Cyberpunk 2077. The pandemic was in full swing, and so was the global chip shortage. So, getting an RTX 3080 at near MSRP felt like winning the lottery. Fast forward to 2025, and things have become even worse with the launch of NVIDIA's 50 series. Not only are those graphics cards outrageously expensive, but also nearly impossible to buy at a reasonable price. With a lot of patience and perseverance and a fair bit of FOMO, I managed to get my hands on an RTX 5070 Ti. And before that, I even briefly owned an RTX 5080. But I returned that one. It just wasn't worth the cost for gaming at 1440p ultrawide rather than 4K. Now, I might cover more of these GPU-related elephants in a separate video.
RTX 5070, 4090 performance at 549.
But without much further ado, let's jump straight into today's question. Can the RTX 5070 Ti deliver a smooth path-traced experience in the most demanding AAA games? According to NVIDIA's own list, only 4 current titles really stand out that support full ray tracing or path tracing: Cyberpunk 2077, Alan Wake 2, Indiana Jones and the Great Circle,
Hold your horses!
and Black Myth: Wukong. The other games from this list I won't be covering here, since most of them aren't particularly demanding. As I mentioned, I'm going to put an emphasis on real-world experience. What I mean by that is that I won't compare DLSS off versus on, or quality versus balanced versus performance. No, the reality is simple. If you turn on path tracing, DLSS is a must. And that applies whether you're using a 5070 Ti or even a 5090.
Impossible without artificial intelligence.
But thanks to NVIDIA's new DLSS 4 transformer model, we can go down to balanced, because that's the equivalent of quality mode from DLSS 3. What I will play with are the frame generation settings. Is it a game changer or just ghosting galore when I can't even achieve a 60 FPS base frame rate? Let's find out. One more thing. These new 50 series graphics cards have an incredible overclocking headroom. It is mind-boggling how NVIDIA is shipping these cards with so much performance left under the table. I'll be using my best and stable overclocking profile for this golden sample graphics card that I got here, the MSI 5070 Ti Gaming Trio. It runs quiet and cool. Pay attention to the thermals on my overlay. I've never even heard the fans got to max RPM while gaming. We start off with Cyberpunk 2077, diving straight into Dogtown, one of the most graphically demanding areas from the Phantom Liberty DLC. Here are the video settings. VSync is always disabled in-game, as I've turned it on in the NVIDIA app to make G-Sync work. Full screen mode, resolution 3440x1440, low latency mode on. Graphics settings, DLSS super resolution transformer model and balanced. Full ray tracing maxed out. Most of the advanced settings stay maxed as they have almost zero performance impact. But I reduce volumetric fog resolution and cloud quality to medium. Screen space reflections doesn't matter with path tracing, but I also set it to medium. The following exercise I'm only going to do once for this game, as I mentioned that I want to focus less on number crunching and more on the real gaming experience. comparing stock GPU performance with my overclocking profile with and without frame generation. At stock with no overclocking and frame generation off, we're in the mid-40s FPS range. It's not ideal. Turning frame gen on, we immediately notice a change on the frame time graph. That's expected behavior. Surprisingly, ghosting is minimal. I usually notice it around the car. We can see it a tiny bit here. I did have to completely disable motion blur, which caused heavy ghosting around vehicles. With 2x frame generation on, FPS jumps to the mid-80s. It's not exactly double, remember? Frame gen adds interpolated frames, so true frame time improvement isn't 1-to-1. The calculation here is base FPS minus 10%, then that multiplied by 2, or times 3 or 4 when using multi-frame generation. Latency is something that you guys probably want to know about when using frame generation. Unfortunately, I can only monitor latency in the NVIDIA overlay and not the MSI Afterburner one that we can see here, and I can't get that to appear in my screen recording. But I can tell you now that latency sits around 70 to 80 milliseconds. Now I'm doing the same again, but with my overclock profile applied that I showed earlier, and with frame generation turned off, we see about a 10 to 14% performance uplift. FPS climbs into the 50 to 55 range, a solid gain. Bear in mind that by running the screen recording on the same machine, I lose a tiny bit of performance throughout this entire test. Latency, by the way, is around 45 to 50 milliseconds. With frame generation back on, we're hovering around 90 FPS and latency is slightly lower compared with the stock settings from before, around 60 to 70 milliseconds. That's actually not massively higher than with frame generation turned off. Do we see any visual artifacts or ghosting? Again, maybe a tiny bit around the back of the car if we're really looking for it. This is how I would actually play the game. Next, I'd briefly test multi-frame generation 4x. It's hard to show on YouTube due to the 60 FPS cap, but now we can see severe ghosting and other artifacts around the edges of the car. But what many reviewers don't understand, that this is because my monitor refresh rate is currently set to 144 Hz, and NVIDIA Reflex will cap my FPS 10% below that. So if we see here something around 134 FPS, this divided by 4 is now our baseline FPS, which is only 33.5 FPS. Hence, this introduces so many visual problems, and that's why multi-frame generation is really detrimental on lower refresh monitors. So in all honesty, if you have a 4080 or 4080 Super, you can probably expect a similar optimal outcome that I showed earlier, just using 2x frame generation. But remember to always disable motion blur if you're using frame gen. In all of the following Cyberpunk footage, I still had it set to low, and we do see a lot of ghosting then around the vehicle especially. Now here we are in one of the most memorable main missions from the base game, with a very dense population. Again, we are at a stable 90 FPS with the OC profile and frame gen 2x turned on, similar as in Dogtown. Let's try and push through this crowd here quickly, gain a bit of speed, and I honestly think this looks absolutely fine. Let me know in the comments, is this good enough for you? Or does frame generation ruin the presentation here in this scene? Let me show it again with motion blur disabled to be safe. So the two big questions. Firstly, can the 5070 Ti handle full path tracing at 1440p ultrawide? And secondly, do we really need at least 60 FPS base frame rate to achieve a good visual outcome with frame generation turned on? You be the judge. For me, the answer leans towards yes. It holds up surprisingly well. Is it possible that frame generation has improved in recent updates? I want to get to the bottom of that. It would take nearly 3 more years before a new title emerged with the potential to dethrone Cyberpunk 2077 as the most graphically demanding game, and that title was Alan Wake 2. At first glance, it doesn't seem like a visual rival to Cyberpunk. Levels like Bright Falls lack its scale and verticality. But with full ray tracing enabled, it does feel like a generational leap.
Nice to meet you, Sheriff.
So here are my settings. DLSS unbalanced, frame generation on, no extra visual effects like motion blur. Almost everything is maxed, with two exceptions: volumetric lighting and volumetric spotlight quality are set to medium. Down here with the ray tracing settings, we go all in. So here in Brightfold, we are comfortably above 80 FPS even with frame gen off. So let's move on to the scene that I believe is a good indicator of whether the 5070 Ti can handle max ray tracing in this game. And that is when you return to Cauldron Lake for the second time. This is where it gets interesting. Now look at that, this does look very stunning. And is a lot heavier in performance. We should appreciate this beautiful sunset because it doesn't last very long in this game. Let's take a look at our FPS. Our base FPS has dipped below 60, but is still higher than in Cyberpunk's Dogtown when I was driving around the pyramid. Suddenly it's gone up to 70. Yeah, 44, 45, 46. I can see why some people are saying you have to turn off ray tracing in the forest. But do we really need to? Apparently we need at least 60 FPS for frame generation to become viable. But honestly, where exactly are we seeing any visual problems here in this scene? The updated DLSS 4 suite really helps. In earlier builds I noticed a lot of artifacts and ghosting around this lady's hair, especially with fast camera movements. I must say I'm quite surprised. Maybe it's because I swapped out all the DLLs not only for DLSS Super Resolution but also frame generation and ray reconstruction using DLSS Swapper. Maybe we're onto something here because we can clearly see a massive visual improvement. Possibly by simply updating the DLSS suite to the latest versions. Setting DLSS to latest in the NVIDIA app may achieve the same thing, but to be honest, I prefer having the actual latest DLLs in the game folder to be certain. Now it started raining. Are there any unwanted artifacts? Does this really look so unplayable with these near max settings? So what's the latency again, you ask? We're at about 84 to 86 milliseconds here. For AAA single player games, that's totally fine. Now let's have a look at the next game, and that one's a bit of a mixed bag. Indiana Jones and the Great Circle. On one hand, it's incredibly well optimized and runs great on older GPUs. But on the other, it's extremely VRAM hungry. Now, in most of these games, it's important for me to use max ray tracing settings because I slightly prefer visual fidelity over performance. But even with 16 GB of VRAM, I had to make some compromises in this game. Frame rate suddenly dropped below 10 FPS when VRAM maxed out. This happened especially with DLSS set to quality and frame generation on. FrameGen increases VRAM usage a lot. To fix this, we either reduce texture pool size setting or set DLSS to balanced. Perhaps we can also recover some FPS by lowering shadow quality a bit. Still looks fantastic. Now this game I started playing with my 3080 with 10 GB of VRAM, but of course not with path tracing turned on. It ran absolutely fine with the basic ray tracing settings until I hit certain zones like the Himalayas or Sukhothai. The latter is the most graphically demanding area by far. Things ran super smooth, for example in the Vatican or even in Gizeh, but as soon as I reached those areas, I really encountered severe performance dips and weird DLSS stutters, some of which were remediated in later updates. Now on the 5070 Ti, I'm happy to report that I can move around Sukhothai without any issues. Here's an example with frame generation turned off, so we can see what the base frame rate is. And as you can see, again, it doesn't reach 60 FPS. In fact, it constantly seems to dip below 50. Turning FrameGen back on, do we notice any unwanted artifacts or unpleasant ghosting? To prove that I'm not just editing around my visual problems, I'm going to show you a raw clip of me quickly taking out a military camp.
Quando avremo finito un...
Off!
Brutto segno! Uomo a terra! Il responsabile deve essere qui attorno!
Arrenditi finché puoi. Forza, levagli quel sorrisetto!
Oh, don't mind me, just eating some fruit here.
Hold your horses!
Maybe I should have increased the game's difficulty a bit.
Prendi! Ehi, fermo dove sei! Prendi questo!
Now, last but not least, the final four of those games. Black Myth Wukong. It's the only one of those four that I actually haven't 100%ed yet. I only recently started playing it and I haven't finished it because it's too bloody difficult and I'm getting too old for some of these ridiculous boss fights. I know for many of you these Souls-type games are the pinnacle of the gaming world. And honestly, I can see why. Now here in Black Myth Wukong, I'm actually not quite certain which of the levels is the graphically most demanding one, but the free benchmark tool on Steam uses an early forest area, which I'm assuming is a good baseline. Now, Black Myth Wukong is a tremendous effort as a debut from new Chinese independent developers Game Science. But unfortunately, optimization is not its strong point, and many of the settings need to be lowered from the max cinematic setting when enabling very high ray tracing, or path tracing. You can see the settings I settled on here after consulting optimization guides from Digital Foundry or Hardware Unboxed. And this is a very fast game, so here we'd more likely run into motion problems such as ghosting or other artifacts. On earlier frame-gen builds, the character's feet looked really strange while running. But again, now that I'm recording this footage, I'm under the impression that it's not as bad as when I had older DLLs in the game folder. This is all anecdotal evidence at best and warrants a more thorough investigation in a separate video. And now, as a special treat to close out this video, I challenged myself to defeat one of the harder bosses from the earlier game, the Tiger Vanguard. So before I said that I'd rather sacrifice some FPS in favor of the best possible visual fidelity in these games. When I spend over $1,000 on a new NVIDIA GPU, I expect to be buying a sort of privilege to not having to sacrifice image quality for a while. But in this type of game, I think we need to prioritize performance so we don't run into any stuttering or immersive breaking visual problems that would compromise our efforts to tackle these ludicrously hard boss fights. What do you think? Is this a smooth and visually acceptable experience? Was the RTX 5070 Ti up to the task of full ray tracing, testing it in the graphically most demanding areas in each of these games? I hope so. Annoyingly, Black Myth Wukong just received its official DLSS 4 update shortly after I completed all my screen recordings. But before updating, I checked once more what DLSS version it was using. DLSS indicator says preset K, so this verifies that I had already successfully injected DLSS 4 into this game before. The key takeaway of this project for me is that we certainly seem to be able to get much better results with frame generation at below 60 base frame rates. And this is something that requires further investigation. To play devil's advocate here for a moment, the fact that there are still only 4 major titles that offer path tracing goes to show how NVIDIA failed to make hardware ray tracing a mainstream thing. This comes as no surprise given the chaotic GPU market conditions over the recent years. Look, if you don't care about any of these 4 games that I've showed here, there's no reason to stress yourself out over the 50 series, and you might as well just join Team Red at this point. But even then, good luck finding a Radeon 9070 XT at a decent price. If you, like me, want to upgrade from a 30 series or older generation and not miss out on playing certain titles such as Black Myth Wukong on max settings, which runs like dog shit on AMD, we must beißen in den grünen sauren Apfel, yeah? What's the alternative to PC gaming? Are things looking any better for consoles? You pay a whopping €750 for a PS5 Pro now, and it's not even looking likely that it will run GTA 6 at 60 FPS. All the Nintendo fanboys and girls are eagerly awaiting the arrival of the Switch 2 and will, without hesitation, fork out €470 for that one. But then 80 to 90 euros for the games? No thanks. I'll quit rambling now. Will I finally beat this guy after the 15th attempt? Let's fast forward to the conclusion. Yes, we can. So there we have it. Let me know in the comments below what you thought of this little demonstration. Like and subscribe if you want to see more of this kind of stuff. And I see you in the next video.